In the heart of the Alaskan wilderness, a family of 5 lived a solitary, off-grid life until they inexplicably vanished in 1996. The official investigation, based on a tragic assumption, concluded they had succumbed to the elements. For 10 years, their case was frozen in time, buried under layers of ice and unanswered questions. But the truth was not in the wilderness at all. It was waiting inside their cabin, discovered only when a man looking to buy the property noticed a vile sight: maggots emerging from the floorboards. The story began with Gwendolyn Wareight's final trip of the season to her son's homestead in late October 1996. The track she navigated was barely a road, a treacherous ribbon of mud and exposed roots carved through a dense forest of spruce and birch. The sky was the color of a fresh bruise, and the air was sharp with the impending deep freeze. Gwendolyn, a woman with a no-nonsense grip on the steering wheel, knew this land intimately. It was her son, Bastian Pasternak, who had chosen this life for himself, his wife Vesper, and their 3 children, Isadora, 10, Zara, 8, and Bram, 6. Their rustic, self-built cabin was their world, a home built of stone and wood, miles from civilization. As she rounded the final bend and entered the familiar clearing, Gwendolyn was immediately struck by the silence. It was a suffocating quiet, unlike the usual peaceful hum of the woods. There was no smoke from the chimney, no sound of the children playing, and no sight of Bastian working outside. The cabin stood alone, a silent sentinel against the backdrop of the towering forest, its solitude feeling more like an abandonment than a choice. Stepping out of her sturdy 4-wheel drive, her boots crunching on the frost-hardened earth, she noticed the outdoor fire pit was cold, filled with nothing but charred logs and gray ash. She called their names, her voice sounding small and brittle, but the vast emptiness of the clearing swallowed her words. A sense of deep unease settled over her as she approached the cabin. The front door was unlocked, a detail that wasn't unusual for a family with no neighbors or fear of intruders. Inside, however, was a puzzling scene. The cabin was remarkably orderly. Winter supplies, dried meats, canned goods, and firewood were all neatly stocked. Clothing was hung up and dishes were clean and put away. It looked as if the family had just stepped out for a moment, fully intending to return. Yet they were gone. She moved through the small rooms, checking the sleeping loft and the main living area. Beds were made, and Vesper's sewing materials lay untouched on a small table. There were no signs of a struggle or a rushed departure. It was as if the family had simply vanished into thin air. Returning outside, she performed a wider sweep of the property, checking the outhouse and the storage shed. It was then that she made the most critical discovery. The family's heavy-duty truck, their sole link to the outside world, was also missing. This realization turned her unease into a sharp, piercing alarm. Without the truck, they couldn't have gone far. Yet they were nowhere on the property. There was no note, no message, no explanation. After a frantic hour of searching and calling out until her voice was hoarse, Gwendolyn understood she was in a dangerous situation herself. The isolation her son had cherished now felt like a grave threat. She forced herself back into her vehicle and began the long, arduous journey toward the nearest settlement, her mind a blur of anxiety and disbelief. Upon reaching civilization, she immediately contacted the Alaska State Troopers and reported her family missing. She provided them with a recent photograph, a warm portrait of the 5 of them smiling in front of their cabin. Bastian stood tall in his plaid flannel shirt and wide-brimmed hat. Vesper crouched beside him in her distinct coral shirt and mustard yellow pants, and the 3 children beamed between them. It was a perfect snapshot of a life, now starkly contrasted by their sudden, inexplicable absence. The disappearance of the Pasternak family triggered an immediate, large-scale search, but its direction was heavily influenced by the environment. The homestead's remote location and the approaching winter made a search immensely difficult. When investigators learned the family's only vehicle was missing, the prevailing theory was born. They had been in an accident. Authorities hypothesized that the Pasternaks had attempted a late-season supply run and encountered disaster on the treacherous route. In the unforgiving Alaskan landscape, a simple mistake could be fatal. A massive search and rescue operation was launched. The scale was daunting, encompassing hundreds of square miles of dense forest, winding river valleys, and steep mountain passes. Helicopters and planes flew in low grids, their rhythmic thud echoing over the valleys as pilots searched for any sign of the missing truck, a glint of metal or tire tracks veering off the path. On the ground, teams of volunteers and trained personnel pushed through thick underbrush and icy streams, their efforts hampered by the plummeting temperatures and the first flurries of snow. The search was comprehensive in its scope, but entirely focused on finding a tragic accident. While the external search was underway, investigators did conduct a brief examination of the Pasternak cabin. However, their approach was shaped by the belief that the family had simply left and not returned. They were looking for clues about their destination, not for a crime scene. They walked through the rooms, noting the orderly state and the lack of any sign of forced entry, a struggle, or blood. To the troopers, the scene was consistent with a family that had simply stepped out and failed to come home. Because it wasn't considered a crime scene, the cabin was not processed with forensic rigor. They didn't dust for fingerprints or collect trace evidence. They checked the rooms and closets but never inspected the more difficult-to-access areas, like the shallow crawl space beneath the floorboards, which was accessible through panels. Gwendolyn, consumed by anxiety and frustration, vehemently objected to the direction of the investigation. She argued that the authorities were fundamentally misunderstanding her son. Bastian was not a reckless amateur. He was an expert survivalist who knew the land intimately. The idea that he would have driven his family into such a risk, or that he would be unable to survive a breakdown, was inconceivable to her. She pleaded with the investigators to look closer at the homestead, but her concerns were largely dismissed. Gwendolyn felt a growing bitterness, convinced that the investigation was inadequate and colored by prejudice. She believed the troopers were lazy, unwilling to dedicate the necessary resources because the Pasternaks lived an unconventional life. In their eyes, she felt, the family was just another group of dreamers who had been swallowed by the bush. As the days turned into weeks, the weather worsened rapidly. The first heavy snows fell, blanketing the landscape and burying any potential clues. The temperatures plummeted, making survival in the open impossible. The extensive search efforts were reluctantly called off. The disappearance of Bastian, Vesper, Isadora, Zara, and Bram Pasternak was officially categorized as a likely tragic accident. The case went cold, buried under the snow and the weight of official assumptions. Gwendolyn was left alone with her grief and her unanswered questions. She refused to accept that her family was gone forever and took on the responsibility of maintaining the cabin, making the arduous journey several times a year. The cabin became a silent vigil in the wilderness, a physical manifestation of her unresolved grief and a testament to her refusal to accept the official story. For 10 years, from 1996 to 2006, the remote Alaskan wilderness kept the secret of the Pasternak family's disappearance. Their case was a cold trail, a forgotten file in a police station, a sad memory for the community. During this time, Gwendolyn Wainwright's hope slowly faded. She found herself alone, maintaining the family's distant homestead. The physical and financial strain of the constant upkeep was immense, but the emotional burden was even heavier. The cabin, which had once represented her son's dream, now felt like a monument to a tragedy she couldn't comprehend. By the summer of 2006, Gwendolyn was emotionally and physically exhausted. She had no choice but to sell the property, as she could no longer bear the emotional weight and practical demands of the isolated life. The listing attracted people who craved a life of solitude and self-sufficiency. Among them was Arlo Finch, a seasoned builder who was aware of the cabin's history, but was more interested in its structural integrity. He made plans to visit and inspect the cabin thoroughly. Arlo arrived on a bright July afternoon. The cabin, despite its age, was still structurally sound, a testament to its original builder, Bastian, and Gwendolyn's diligent care. Arlo began his inspection methodically, checking the foundation, walls, and roof before moving inside. The interior was small and simple, filled with the stale air of a long-abandoned space. He carefully examined the floorboards, looking for rot or damage. As he moved through the room, his eyes caught an odd detail in a corner near the wood stove. The floorboards here were slightly uneven and seemed to be discolored. He initially thought it was just old dirt or water damage. As he knelt for a closer look, he saw a single maggot wriggling against the dark wood. He frowned, knowing that maggots usually meant something was decaying nearby, likely a small dead animal. He decided to investigate further to assess any potential damage. The boards in that corner were loose, meant to be removable. He used a pry bar to lift a board, which felt unexpectedly heavy. When he turned it over, he was confronted with a sickening sight. A thick layer of dark, moist, decomposing matter and more maggots clinging to it. The moment the board was lifted, a faint, sickly sweet odor rose from the opening, a smell Arlo instantly recognized as decomposition. This was no dead squirrel. He held the board up, pointing a small stick at the maggots to get a sense of the scale of the decay. It was clear to him now that this was far more serious. He peered into the dark, shallow crawl space, shining his powerful flashlight into the gloom. At first, he only saw dirt and the underside of the floor, but as he swept the beam toward the corner, it illuminated an unsettling sight. Partially hidden in the shadows, wrapped in what looked like old blankets, was a human hand. The flesh was dried and mummified. Further into the shadows, he could make out the shape of a torso and legs. Human remains were tucked away in the deepest part of the crawl space. Arlo stumbled back from the opening in horror, his heart pounding. He fled the cabin, quickly securing the door before driving straight to the nearest Alaska State Trooper station. The drive was a blur of shock and adrenaline. He reported his grim discovery, and the homestead was instantly transformed from a missing persons site into a crime scene. A forensic team was dispatched to the remote cabin. The recovery process was difficult due to the cramped crawl space. They had to remove more floorboards to get the body out. When the remains were finally brought into the light, it was clear they had been there for a long time. The cold, dry microclimate of the insulated crawl space had acted as a natural preservative, slowing down the decomposition process. The body, while mummified, was largely preserved. The discovery shattered the long-held belief that the Pastesternak family had simply disappeared into the wild. The mystery now centered on the cabin itself. The remains were taken to the medical examiner's office. Through dental records, they were identified as Vesper Pastesternak, the mother of the missing family. She had been found hidden beneath the floor of her own home. The new questions that arose were terrifying. Where were Bastian and the 3 children, and who had killed Vesper? After 10 years of being considered a tragic accident, the case of the missing Pasternak family took a dark turn when Vesper Pasternak's body was found hidden under the floorboards of their remote Alaskan cabin. This discovery instantly transformed the mystery into a murder investigation, a task now assigned to seasoned Detective Daxon Hughes of the Alaska State Troopers Major Crimes Unit. Hughes, a father himself, felt a profound sense of urgency, particularly for the fate of the 3 missing children, as their mother's murder suggested a far more sinister reason for their disappearance. The first step was a meticulous autopsy of Vesper's remains. Forensic experts in 2006, equipped with modern technology, determined that Vesper had died from a single gunshot wound to her chest. The trajectory and nature of the wound indicated a close-range confrontation, leaving no doubt that her death was a homicide. As the autopsy was underway, a forensic team scoured the cabin, treating the crawl space where the body was found as a primary crime scene. Their careful work led to a crucial breakthrough. A rusted hunting rifle was found hidden near Vesper's body, wrapped in a piece of oil cloth. The rifle was immediately taken to the state crime lab. Ballistics tests confirmed it was the weapon used to kill Vesper. Despite being corroded, its serial number was still traceable, revealing that the gun was registered to Bastian Pasternak, Vesper's husband. The evidence seemed to form a clear and damning narrative. Bastian had murdered his wife with his own gun, hidden her body, and then fled with their 3 children, Isadora, Zara, and Bram, and the family's truck. The focus of the investigation shifted from a missing persons case to a nationwide manhunt for Bastian, now the prime suspect in a domestic homicide and abduction case. Detective Hughes initiated a massive search for Bastian and the children, who would now be young adults. He distributed age-progressed images across North America, focusing on isolated communities where the family might have sought to live off the grid. However, the manhunt yielded no immediate results. Seeking to understand a possible motive, Hughes interviewed Gwendolyn Wainwright, Bastian's mother. Gwendolyn, grief-stricken and loyal to her son, adamantly defended him, describing him as a loving husband and devoted father. She believed the authorities were rushing to judgment, just as they had a decade earlier. During the interview, she revealed a crucial piece of information that had previously been overlooked. Her youngest grandson, Bram, had been suffering from a mysterious, chronic illness in the months leading up to the family's disappearance. Gwendolyn explained that Bram's symptoms, lethargy, skin rashes, and digestive issues, had baffled local doctors. She said Bastian had become obsessed, convinced that something in their environment was poisoning his son. He had begun meticulously testing their well water and the soil, believing he needed to identify the source of the contamination to save his family. Gwendolyn insisted his behavior was not that of a killer but a desperate father. While the physical evidence pointed to Bastian as the murderer, Hughes, ever meticulous, filed this information away, sensing its potential importance. As the manhunt stalled, Hughes found himself returning to Gwendolyn's account. The image of Bastian as a frantic father didn't fit the profile of a cold-blooded killer. He pressed Gwendolyn for more details, and she revealed that Bastian had mailed a package with his environmental findings and samples to an investigative journalist known for covering environmental issues. This was the first tangible lead outside the immediate crime scene. Hughes embarked on a painstaking search for the journalist. Weeks of research led him to Roland Jessup, a retired reporter living a reclusive life in the Pacific Northwest. Hughes flew out to meet Jessup in person. The meeting was tense, as Jessup was initially guarded and seemed haunted by something from his past. But when Hughes mentioned the package from Bastian, Jessup's demeanor changed, revealing a profound fear. Jessup confirmed he had received a package from Bastian in 1996, containing letters detailing his son's illness and samples of water and soil. He had been intrigued, but had abandoned the story after receiving anonymous, specific threats against his family. The threats were so terrifying that he dropped the investigation, which contributed to his early retirement. However, driven by a lingering sense of guilt, he had kept the evidence in a secure location for a decade. Hughes realized the gravity of Jessup's story. The fact that someone had gone to such lengths to silence a journalist suggested Bastian's claims were not paranoid delusions, but a dangerous truth. The conspiracy was far more extensive than he had imagined. The package was sent to a specialized lab for analysis. The results were shocking. The samples contained extremely high concentrations of toxic heavy metals and specialized chemical compounds. The discovery validated Bastian's claims and shifted the motive of the murder away from domestic conflict to a possible cover-up. The Pasternak land was poisoned. The lab identified the chemicals as industrial solvents, commonly used in oil and gas extraction. Hughes launched an investigation into Alaska Petrox, a company with operations near the Pasternak homestead, suspecting illegal dumping. The company was defensive and uncooperative, but after an exhaustive investigation, they were ultimately cleared of wrongdoing. The critical breakthrough came when the lab refined its analysis. The solvents were not typical commercial products, but specialized, military-grade chemicals. The realization that the contamination was localized to the Pasternak property and the chemicals were not from the oil company deepened the mystery and opened up a new, more sinister avenue of investigation. The new lead caused a divide within the police team. Some investigators, doubting the contamination theory and Gwendolyn's claims, argued that Bastian was still the killer. But Hughes remained convinced that the contamination was the key to solving the mystery, even as the source remained elusive, and the truth was buried as deep as the toxins in the Alaskan soil. After years of stalled progress, the investigation into the disappearance of the Pasternak family hit another dead end in the spring of 2007. Detective Hughes had followed a promising lead to the Alaska Petro X company, only to discover a dead end. While he had confirmed the presence of highly toxic military-grade chemicals in the local soil, he couldn't trace their origin. These dangerous solvents were a crucial clue, hinting at a sophisticated and organized operation, yet the lead went nowhere. The military's secretive bureaucracy made it nearly impossible to track the source, and Hughes found himself under increasing pressure from his superiors. His bosses wanted him to drop the environmental angle and focus solely on finding Bastian Pasternak. The prevailing theory in the department was that Bastian had murdered his wife, Vesper, whose body was found in their home, and then vanished with their children. They believed the story of poisoning was a distraction, a paranoid fantasy concocted by Bastian himself, which ultimately led him to violence. Hughes felt isolated, fighting a two-front war against both the unknown perpetrators of the contamination and the deep-seated skepticism of his own colleagues. Just when it seemed the official theory would win out, a major breakthrough occurred. A team of forestry workers on an aerial survey discovered a vehicle wreckage at the bottom of a deep ravine, located about 80 miles from the Pasternak family's cabin. The site was remote and dangerous, hidden by a dense forest canopy. The wreckage was identified as the Pasternak family truck, which had been missing for over a decade. The discovery sparked a massive retrieval operation. The rugged terrain required the use of heavy-lift helicopters and specialized equipment. The dangerous, multi-day effort highlighted just how isolated the crash site was. Intense media coverage reignited public interest, and for many, the discovery confirmed the initial assumption of a tragic accident in the wilderness. Once the crushed truck was brought to a secure facility, investigators began a painstaking forensic analysis. The evidence found within the wreckage seemed to provide a grim narrative of the family's final moments, pointing the finger squarely at Bastian. They found a second rifle, also registered to him, which had been missing from the cabin. This suggested he had been armed when he fled. More chillingly, a watertight container was found with a small amount of the same toxic chemicals that had poisoned the Pasternak land. The official conclusion was that Bastian had been handling the chemicals, perhaps for some illegal purpose, and had accidentally poisoned his son, Bram. Adding to the grim scene, clothing belonging to all three children, Isadora, Zara, and Bram, was scattered among the debris. Although no human remains were found, the presence of their clothes led investigators to believe they had been in the truck at the time of the crash. This evidence seemed to support a tragic murder-suicide scenario. Bastian, perhaps driven by guilt over poisoning his son or simply unhinged, had murdered Vesper, hidden her body, and fled with the children. Overwhelmed and desperate, he had then driven the truck off the cliff, killing himself and the children. The lack of remains was attributed to the high-impact crash and a decade of decomposition and scavenging. For the police department, the case was considered closed. The narrative of a family tragedy fueled by the pressures of off-grid living and an accidental poisoning was compelling and seemingly backed by solid evidence. The department prepared to officially close the case. However, Detective Hughes felt a deep sense of unease. The discovery of the truck felt too perfectly timed, too convenient. After months of getting nowhere, the sudden appearance of evidence that flawlessly implicated Bastian and exonerated the mysterious poisoner struck him as suspicious. The entire narrative seemed to tie up all the loose ends, confirming the dominant theory and silencing the questions about the contamination. He decided to conduct his own meticulous review of the crash site and the truck's forensics. He focused on the physics of the crash, studying the trajectory of the vehicle and the damage it sustained. His findings directly contradicted the official report. The damage on the truck was not consistent with a vehicle that had been driven off a cliff at high speed. The crush pattern indicated a much lower velocity impact, as if the truck had been pushed or rolled over the edge rather than driven. Furthermore, his analysis of the ground at the top of the ravine revealed no tire tracks, no skid marks, no evidence of a vehicle accelerating or braking. The truck had been stationary before it went over. Hughes realized the crash was not an accident or a suicide, it was staged. He became convinced the truck had been intentionally placed in the ravine, likely moved from a different, long-term hiding place. The incriminating evidence, the rifle, the chemicals, the children's clothing, had been deliberately planted inside to frame Bastian and shut down the investigation into the poisoning. This shocking realization pointed to a powerful and sophisticated enemy, someone with the resources and cunning to orchestrate such an elaborate cover-up, someone who was actively monitoring the investigation and manipulating it from the shadows. If the crash was a setup, then Bastian Pasternak was not the murderer but another victim. This meant the true killers were still out there, organized, ruthless, and operating with impunity in the vast wilderness of Alaska. Aware of the immense danger, Hughes decided to keep his suspicions to himself. He knew that if he was right, he wasn't just investigating a single murder, but a complex conspiracy that likely involved powerful interests that had already proven their willingness to kill to protect their secrets. After months of being stonewalled by his own department, Detective Hughes felt a shift in the investigation. The staged truck crash, meant to close the book on the Pasternak case, did the opposite. It confirmed his suspicion that this wasn't an accident but a deliberate cover-up orchestrated by a well-funded organization. The key, he realized, lay not in the crash, but in the specific military-grade solvents found on the Pasternak's land. Hughes began a painstaking search for the source of the chemicals. He spent weeks poring over classified military procurement and disposal records from the mid-1990s, a bureaucratic maze he navigated by leveraging old connections. His search focused on military bases within a few hundred miles of the Pasternak homestead, specifically looking for any inconsistencies in hazardous material disposal logs. The work was slow and meticulous, a forensic accounting exercise of thousands of documents. His diligence paid off when he uncovered a glaring discrepancy in the disposal records from a nearby military base dated 1996. The records showed a contract for $3.4 million to dispose of a large quantity of hazardous waste, including the specific solvents he had been tracking. The documents were flawless, indicating the materials had been shipped to a legitimate disposal facility in the lower 48 states. But when Hughes contacted the facility, they had no record of receiving the shipment. The chain of custody was broken, the money was gone, and the toxic waste had simply vanished. This discovery confirmed Hughes's theory. The money had been embezzled, and the waste had been illegally dumped in the remote Alaskan wilderness, not knowing that it would eventually poison young Bram. The Pasternak family's tragedy wasn't a freak accident, but the result of a calculated criminal conspiracy. The case had a motive. Bastian Pasternak had stumbled upon the illegal operation while hunting, and in his attempt to expose the crime, had been murdered along with his family. Hughes now knew what he was up against. He focused on identifying the individuals behind the embezzlement. He traced the authorization for the disposal contract to 3 high-ranking officers: Colonel Cyrus B. Arderick, the ringleader; Major Taryn Forrester, the logistics officer who falsified the manifests; and Captain Ephraim Lynch, who oversaw the physical dumping. These were not small-time criminals but powerful, respected men with a long history of corruption and murder. Hughes, now a target himself, knew he had to proceed with extreme caution. He began discreetly investigating the 3 officers, gathering evidence of their financial activities and movements from 1996. He put them under surveillance, watching for any sign of panic as he closed in. The conspirators, realizing that the recent staged accident had backfired, understood that Hughes was getting dangerously close to the truth. They decided to act, their focus shifting to the one person who could truly expose them: Gwendolyn Wainwright, who had kept the case alive for a decade. Hughes had been in regular contact with her, but one evening his calls went unanswered. A cold dread settled over him. He drove to Gwendolyn's house and found the door kicked in. Furniture was overturned and belongings were scattered. She was gone. The conspirators had kidnapped her. The realization galvanized Hughes. The conspiracy was no longer a historical crime but an active, immediate threat. He had a narrow window to save Gwendolyn. He mobilized a tactical response, initiating emergency tracking on the 3 suspects. The surveillance paid off, leading him to Forrester and Lynch at a remote, rented warehouse outside of Anchorage. Hughes was certain they were holding Gwendolyn there. He assembled a tactical team and briefed them on the mission: rescue Gwendolyn unharmed and apprehend the suspects. In the pre-dawn hours, the team descended on the warehouse. The silence was broken only by the distant hum of industrial activity. After securing the perimeter, they executed a dynamic entry, storming the building. Inside, the vast, dimly lit space was cluttered with crates and machinery. The team moved systematically, flashlights cutting through the gloom, until they found them in a small office at the back. Forrester and Lynch were there, armed and holding a bound and gagged Gwendolyn hostage. She was terrified but alive. A tense standoff ensued, with Hughes attempting to negotiate a peaceful resolution. But the desperate conspirators, with their backs against the wall, refused to surrender. When Forrester made a threatening move toward Gwendolyn, the tactical team responded instantly. A brief, violent confrontation erupted, and the team quickly subdued the suspects. Gwendolyn was rescued, physically unharmed, and taken to safety. Simultaneously, another team raided Colonel B. Arderick's home, arresting him without incident. The conspiracy was shattered. With the 3 conspirators in custody, the investigation moved quickly. The evidence against them was overwhelming. Under intense interrogation, Captain Ephraim Lynch, the most vulnerable of the 3, confessed to everything. He detailed the intricate plot, from the illegal dumping of the military waste to the subsequent murders. Their motive was simple greed, the $3.4 million disposal fee outweighing any sense of morality. He confirmed that they had dumped the toxic barrels in a remote location, a decision that would lead to the contamination of the Pasternak's land. Lynch revealed that their operation was compromised in 1996 when Bastian Pasternak stumbled upon them while hunting. To silence him, they murdered him on the spot and buried his body nearby. To cover their tracks and shift any potential investigation away from the dump site, they located the Pasternak's cabin, murdered Vesper with her husband's hunting rifle to frame him, and hid her body and the weapon in the crawl space. Then they abducted the 3 children, Isadora, Zara, and Bram, taking the family truck to make it seem as though Bastian had fled with them. The children, witnesses to their mother's murder, were then killed shortly after the abduction. Lynch's confession led authorities to the dump site. It was a barren wasteland of rusted, leaking barrels and stunted vegetation. Buried in a shallow grave were the remains of the 3 Pasternak children, a devastating final discovery. The bodies of Isadora, Zara, and Bram were finally recovered. Colonel Cyrus B. Arderick, Major Taryn Forrester, and Captain Ephraim Lynch were charged, convicted, and sentenced to life in prison. Throughout the trial, they remained remorseless. For Gwendolyn Wainwright, the resolution brought no peace, only a profound, horrific understanding of the truth. Her entire family was not taken by the wilderness they loved, but by the unimaginable greed and depravity of three men.